I am glad to open working session number 10 today with the specifically selected topic of rights of persons belonging to national minorities, including an address by the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. This morning's session is going to review the implementation of commitments in the field of protection and promotion of the rights of persons belonging to national minorities, to identify main challenges in this area and to share best practices with a focus on education rights and the right to effective participation. So the morning session will deal with the education rights of persons belonging to national minorities, and the afternoon session will deal with the rights of persons belonging to national minorities to effective participation. Some of the issues that some of the questions that we will try to answer during this session are: how is access of minorities to quality education safeguarded in national educational systems, or what are the obstacles to equal access to education for minorities? What is the experience in some of the OSCE participating states with special measures aimed at promoting better access of minorities to education at primary, secondary, vocational and tertiary levels? What mechanisms exist to ensure that minorities participate in development of educational policies? Or also, how can the OSCE, its institutions and field missions better assist participating states in implementing commitments related to education rights of persons belonging to national minorities? To help us with this and some other questions, I'm very pleased to have as our introducer for this morning session, Mrs. Astrid Thors. Very well known, doesn't need introduction, but let me say a few words. She is the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, and before beginning her mandate as the High Commissioner on 20th August 2013, Mrs. Thors, a lawyer by education, was a member of Finnish Parliament from 2004 to 2013. She also served as Minister of Migration and European Affairs between 2007 and 2011, and was a member of the European Parliament until 2004. As High Commissioner, she leads her institution within the security dimension of the OSCE. In accordance with her mandate, she identifies and addresses causes of ethnic tensions and conflicts. The High Commissioner addresses the short-term triggers of inter-ethnic tensions or conflict and long-term structural concerns. And to help us through the discussions this morning, it is also my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mr. Vincent de Graaf, Senior Advisor and Head of Section in the Office of the OSCE High Commissioner of National Minorities. He has a broad background in international law, diplomacy and human rights, and is the Senior Advisor as well as the Head of Section responsible for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia. He is a specialist in European and public international law and holds law degrees from universities of Aix-Marseille, Maastricht and Cambridge. Mr. de Graaf previously worked for the Legal Service of the European Commission, the Directorate of Legal Affairs of the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Netherlands Council of State in the fields of EU enlargement, human rights, migration, and EU law. He is a regular guest lecturer at different universities on human and minority rights, and serves as member of the Board of Editors of Security and Human Rights, a scientific journal published by Brill International. With this, I would like now to hand over the floor to our moderator, so Vincent.
Thank you, Beatrice. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to moderate this session today and to welcome you once again to the National Minorities Day at ODIHR. This promises to be a very interesting and lively session. The issues we will discuss today are high on the international agenda. This is evidenced by a number of factors, including the fact that we have an almost record number of side events today, and I believe I counted 9 of them. The High Commissioner, in her introduction, will highlight a number of important developments, concerns, and issues in the issues on our agenda today. Let me, for my part, remind you of a number of rules intended to facilitate our discussion today. Even though we have a full day with 2 full sessions dedicated to this issue, I think we will be pressed for time nevertheless. Therefore, I would like to draw your attention to the strict time limits with which you are undoubtedly familiar, but which I will enforce ruthlessly, and I will plead the excuse of my citizenship for this occasion. As the Dutch Minister of Finance in Brussels once said, I am Dutch, so I can be blunt. When you do make a statement, I would ask you to please introduce yourself and the organization you're representing. We would prefer you not to read out pre-prepared written statements, but rather to circulate these, as this will facilitate the discussion. If, however, you do read out a written statement, we would like you to start with the concrete recommendations at the beginning of your statement and then follow up on these during your intervention. Please also specify to whom you are addressing these recommendations. That can be OSCE in general, OSCE specific structures, participating states, other international organizations, or civil society actors. Finally, I would like to remind you that as this could be not only an interesting but sometimes heated discussion, that the main aim of this session is to discuss the implementation of OSCE commitments and how to review these, refine implementation, and foster respect for them. I call your attention finally to the speakers list. If you haven't registered, please do so with my colleagues from ODIHR behind us. With that reminder, it gives me great pleasure to hand over the floor to Mrs. Astrid Thors, the High Commissioner.
Thank you both to Beatrice and Vincent. Thank you for all being this on this Monday morning, so numerous. I hope it's an expression of the interest in the challenges for OSCE, because we are confronted with critical questions. One of the most critical questions is how to ensure the respect for the commitments undertaken by the participating states in the Helsinki Final Act and elaborated further throughout the years. Increasing aggressive nationalism that we thought had faded away in the new century is a serious concern, especially for my institution, which is mandated to deal with the prevention of conflicts involving national minorities. In my view, there is more talk about us and the others. Such a way of defining our society endangers the coexistence of different groups, be they ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or religious. It also hampers the successful integration of diverse societies. There are symptoms of retreat from multilateralism in favor of unilateral action in the area of minority protection. In one way or another, states attempt to protect their kin, ethnic kin, but sometimes fail to protect minorities within their own jurisdiction. Manipulation of the real or perceived rights and interests of minorities is counterproductive. Such actions treat minorities as instruments in a wider international political game and thus weaken the international regime for protecting minority rights. Unfortunately, we see radical nationalist forces that have gained influence who are preaching this approach. Why should we be concerned about the excessive bilateralizations of minority rights and issues? Bilateral treaties have a valuable role to play in managing interethnic issues between states, but they cannot replace the multilateral approach. Our recent history has shown us time and again that concerns for minorities abroad can have a detrimental effect on interstate relations. This can too easily lead to minority issues becoming conflict issues. This is precisely why the international community has worked over the past 20 years to strengthen the international framework for the protection of national minorities and to create forums to address interethnic tensions through dialogue. The AGM is the opportunity to remind ourselves that states should follow the rules and principles established in international human rights documents when dealing with the protection of persons belonging to national minorities abroad. States should involve and support multilateral instruments and mechanisms which have been created to support the implementation of standards and commitments relating to minorities. States should make good and fair use of all available international instruments to peacefully and effectively address possible disputes and to avoid conflicts over minority issues. This is precisely why the High Commissioner on National Minorities was established, as we say, in 1992 at Helsinki. The institution has consistently drawn participating states' attention to the potential negative consequences of politicization of minority issues in interstate relations. As you know, we have been actively involved in formulating guidance for states on the issues of minorities in interstate relations. I must remind you once again of the main principles of the 2008 Bolzano-Bosen recommendations on national minorities in interstate relations. 3 things. First, the respect for and protection of minority rights is primarily the responsibility of the state where the minority resides. Second, human rights, including minority rights, are a matter of legitimate concern to the international community. And third, there is a broad range of international bilateral instruments that participating states can use to address such concerns, which they should do with full respect of the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and good neighborly relations. Although a state might have a legitimate interest to support persons of a shared ethnicity living abroad, this does not entitle or imply in any way a right under international law to exercise jurisdiction of these persons. At the same time, it does not preclude a state from granting certain benefits to its kin residing abroad, but this assistance should comply with the principles, as mentioned, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and good neighborly relations. It should be done in consultations with the agreement of the state in which the minority resides. The intention should not be to fuel separatist tendencies. I have seen many fruitful discussions and efforts also well in line with neighborly good relations on provision, for instance, of textbooks and teachers' training, to name a few. Such bilateral agreements and efforts can help the state responsible to provide for the rights of its minorities. On the other hand, the principle of non-discrimination also requires that, for example, scholarships and study opportunities offered to another country and its citizen should not be restricted to an ethnic, linguistic, or regional group. Dear friends, the protection of human rights, including minority rights, is a matter of legitimate concern to the international community, I must stress again and again. States should address their concerns for persons or situations with other states through international cooperation and the conduct of friendly relations. This includes the full support by the states of the international human rights standards and their agreed international monitoring mechanism and commitments. Dear friends, regrettably, the situation is not entirely satisfactory in this respect, even for my institution. The experience of our institution shows that human rights, including minority rights, are essential tools for conflict prevention. Ignoring minority and human rights in conflict resolution may be the source of future conflicts. This is why the topics on the agenda for this special day are highly relevant today and to my conflict prevention mandate. They are also interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Full and effective participation for persons belonging to national minorities is one of the keys to prevent tensions and conflicts. Education, on the other side, is crucial for conflict prevention, but also a way to increase the possibilities for participation, both by the majority and the minority. When education and participation are harmoniously at play, a society stands a better chance of achieving progress and social cohesion. In this way, a society can truly benefit from its diversity, and minorities can be a bridge between states instead of being an obstacle for improved interstate cooperation. Dear friends, education has been high on the H&M agenda ever since its establishment. In 1996, the Hague recommendations regarding the education rights of minorities were published. Education has a critical role to play in promoting the integration of society. Its important role in preserving and fostering minority culture was one of the cornerstones of these recommendations. They also provide guidance on how instruction of and instruction in minority language can be integrated into the education process. Unfortunately, education can also be misused to pursue a divisive nationalistic agenda reflected in politicized curricula. We have seen textbooks riddled with stereotypes and prejudices. We witness divisive history and identity politics being entrenched in the education system. I sincerely hope it would be part of the past and not seen anymore in present societies. This instrumentalization of education can be particularly acute in post-conflict and democratic consolidation phases of societies. There are situations where we see strong ethnic mobilization, polarized media, and weak shared institutions that undermine efforts to manage diversity. In the absence of shared institutions, values, and human interaction and contacts, parallel societies are being built. There is a danger that such society may break apart in the long term. Let me be clear. I am not against separate education institutions for minorities set up by governments, communities, or private entities to provide for education rights of minorities. Studying in such institutions should be a matter of choice. What concerns me is the detrimental effect that the deliberate division of school children along ethnic lines will have on social cohesion if there is no other interaction between groups and if there are not enough efforts to have a common languages. In some countries, Roma children are still being placed in special schools for no reason other than their ethnicity. The long-term costs of separation, whether motivated by ethnic partisan politics or discriminations, are too high to be ignored. Building upon the Hague recommendation, you know about the Ljubljana guidelines of 2012 on integration of societies, and that they include recommendations on integrating diversity also in education system. They suggest that policies are developed with the support of all key stakeholders, including communities, parents, and teachers. Education should be a platform for communication across and between ethnic, cultural, linguistic groups. The Ljubljana guidelines emphasize that schools should hire multi-ethnic staff, share curriculum activities, including through multilingual education, allow students from different communities to mingle through extracurricular activities, and ensure that teaching staff and teaching materials appreciate all communities' contribution to a shared society. Long-term commitment to create an education system that promotes integration is urgently needed. Reform should be evolutionary and not revolutionary, and developed in close consultation with minority communities so that their concerns and needs are also addressed. Over the years, we have focused on the languages that education is provided in. We have been concerned with the right of minorities to study and to be educated in their mother tongue, while recognizing the need for persons belonging to national minorities to learn the official language. We have supported many participating states in their efforts to balance preservation and development of minority culture and identity with the need for minorities to be fluent in the official language or languages in order for them to be fully engaged in public life and realize their potential in the society in which they live. The overall approach, based on the Hague recommendation, has been to recommend a progressive approach, the evolutionary approach. Minority children should be taught in their own language in the first years of education, and the state language should be introduced gradually. Unsurprisingly, the challenges and tensions arise in the way this principle is put into practice. Solutions are always country-specific. The position of the minority language, the numbers of minority students, historical entitlements, parents' involvement in decision about the language of schooling, teacher education, and the availability of textbooks are just a few variables that influence practices. In this regard, a word of caution should be uttered in relation to multilingual education. Although I wholeheartedly support and promote such initiatives, they should not result in any neglect of the right to mother tongue teaching. In my view, the goal of multilingual education is to enhance mother tongue education and complement it with language skills in other languages. And it's often possible to do that. I invite those participating states that have introduced such model to share their experiences today. This brings me to the second topic of the agenda for today's special day, the right of persons belonging to national minorities to full and active participation in public affairs. I just spoke about the involving of minority parents in decisions affecting the education of their children. This is actually a good illustration of one facet of the right of persons belonging to national minorities to full and effective participation in public affairs. This right entails a positive obligation for the state to facilitate the inclusion of minorities, thereby also enhancing good governance, a good governance that cannot be emphasized much enough. Interaction by the state is not an adequate approach. Since we are talking about a right, it's important to clarify what we mean by exercising this right. The 99 Lund recommendations of the effective participation of national minorities in public life of the institution articulated minorities' right to participating, outline different types of arrangement at local, regional, and central levels to ensure that minorities' voices are heard. Consultative arrangement can take different forms and shapes. I'm looking forward to hearing the experiences of participating states in this respect. In the field of electoral processes, as we know, there are a variety of mechanisms for translating minority votes into seats, whether this implies electoral designs that are minority-friendly or that provide for special measures for minorities, such as lower thresholds, reserved seats, or dual voting. Factors such as geographical distribution of minorities, their numerical weight, and historic tradition will influence the selection of one or the other solution. States have a considerable margin of appreciation in this respect. What really matters, though, is that this participation is full and effective, not just symbolic. Efforts to redraw electoral districts in order to favor one group or to the detriment of another is unacceptable, also in the context of minority protection. In this respect, I'm pleased to announce that together with the ODI, my office just last week launched a handbook on observing and promoting the participation of national minorities in electoral processes. This provides an overview of the OSCE's approach to observing and promoting the participation of national minorities in electoral processes. At the same time, as we know, political representation of minorities alone is not sufficient for advancing the full and effective participation of minorities in all aspects of public life. One should also look at the economic, social, and cultural positions of minorities in societies. For example, the commentary on participation of the Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities makes this important link between participation in public affairs and participation in economic and social life. In this respect, it perfectly complements the Lund recommendations. Finally, allow me one comment on trust in public institutions. One cannot expect any citizens, whether they have a minority background or not, to fully participate if they are not treated fairly and with dignity. A fair representation can be an important step to build confidence in a post-conflict situation. Our attention also continues to be drawn to the situation of Roma and Sinti communities who often encounter social marginalization, deprivation, and stigmatization. They face significant challenges in having their concerns heard outside electoral periods, whether by mainstream political parties or by ethnic parties. Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that diversity, whether ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or religious, is the reality of our time. It's a matter of fact, not of definition. Indeed, most of the world's countries are multi-ethnic or becoming multi-ethnic and diverse in all senses of the word. Diversity is not new and it does not need to be problematic, but we live at a time that tests the capacity and willingness of our governments to accommodate ethnic diversity. How we manage our increasingly diverse societies will determine our future and indeed our collective security. In this respect, I should highlight once more the responsibility of the state towards its own population and as an actor in the national community. Just as at the beginning of the 90s, there is a pressing need for states to strengthen security instruments in a holistic way, including in the area of minority rights. The holistic way to look at security is at the heart of both my institution and the OSCE as a whole. Finally, I would like to use this opportunity to extend an invitation from our side to attend a side event among this competition of side events today, which our event is highlighting a number of participating states' experiences in addressing multi-ethnic and linguistic diversity in education. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a lively debate.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for setting out some of the key principles, questions, and challenges when it comes to the complex but vital nexus between the protection and promotion of national minority rights, their integration, and conflict prevention. We have a very full list of speakers already. I note 40 delegations on the list. If you would like to add the name of your organization to this list for this morning's session, then I would like you to do so quickly, because we will close the list. We will now start the discussion. The first three delegations are the United States of America, followed by Ukraine and the Constantinopolitan Society. The accorded time for interventions is 3 minutes, and with that I have the pleasure of opening the session with the contribution by the delegate from the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moderator, and I want to say at the outset that my country strongly supports the work of the High Commissioner, Astrid Thors, and we strongly endorse the statement she's just made. Where adherence to democratic principles and the rule of law are absent, respect for the human rights of members of minority groups, in many cases, sadly, are lacking. You asked that we start with a recommendation. My strong recommendation is that the Russian Federation end its siege in Crimea, end its discrimination against minorities, end its house arrests and its characterization of Crimean Tatars as extremists. Everyone around this table should be deeply concerned about the statement issued by the Russian Foreign Ministry on September 24, where they labeled Tatars as extremists. Now, Russian authorities have long applied broadly worded anti-extremism laws to target individuals and ethnic and religious groups with which they do not agree. The representational assembly of the Tatar people in Mejlis has been forced to vacate its premises in Simferopol following a September 17 court order. The two most prominent community leaders, Mustafa Jimilov and Refat Hubarov, are banned from returning to Crimea for 5 years. In Russian-occupied Crimea, the religious, linguistic, and cultural rights of persons belonging to the Crimea Tatar community are absolutely under siege. And anyone professing to be loyal to Ukraine, the country that Crimea is a part of, are also discriminated against. And this is becoming a police state, and it is a total violation of the commitments of the Russian Federation to the OSCE and its principles of democracy and human rights. We reject the application of repressive Russian laws to Crimea. The United States does not and will not recognize Russia's unilateral attempt at annexation of Crimea. Human rights in Crimea continue to seriously deteriorate for those who actively identify themselves as Ukrainian or as members of other ethnic and religious minorities. So that is our recommendation, and it's a strong one, and we would hope that we would be supported by people around this table. We also want to say that anti-Roma sentiment in eastern Ukraine and Crimea has been demonstrated in violent attacks on homes and threats to Romani men, women, and children. Finally, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we continue to see the denial of the acts of genocide at Srebrenica, and certain ethnic groups are discriminated against there from the possibility of holding the office of the presidency. So finally, we urge all participating states to use the recommendations put forward by the High Commissioner to guide policy responses to national minority concerns. Thank you, Moderator.
Thank you, sir. With that, I would like to announce that the list of speakers for this morning's session is now closed. However, for those willing to intervene, there is, of course, the possibility of doing so in this afternoon's session. With that, I would like to give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Ukraine strongly supports the High Commissioner's mandate and attaches great importance to the activities in the field of protection of the rights of persons belonging to the national minorities. We highly appreciate the HCNM early engagement in assisting my country at this grave moment for Ukraine in the face of military aggression of the Russian Federation towards my country. We consider your visits, the High Commission, to Ukraine, as well as your endeavors within the OSCE Human Rights Assessment Mission to Ukraine, to be very useful. The conclusion of the visits of the High Commissioner, as well as the Human Rights Assessment Missions, numerous reports of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Missions, unequivocally dismissed all allegations of violations of the right of national minorities, including the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and other regions, contrary to the allegations propagated by the Russian Federation. This clearly testifies to the fact that such allegations by the Russian Federation were fabricated as a pretext for violating territorial integrity, sovereignty, and unity of my country, in grave breach of international law and OSCE principles and commitments. And this is absolutely unacceptable in the Europe of the 21st century. We remain very alarmed about the situation in the field of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the occupied Crimea, which remains an integral part of Ukraine. Numerous facts of serious violations against ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, including murders, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, violence, and ill treatment, have been registered by the OSCE and UN independent missions. To give just a few examples, the murder of Reshat Amatov in the territory of Ukraine, whose corpse was found with the signs of torture, disappearance without a trace of social activists Timur Shemardanov and Seyran Zinedinov, mass searches of residential and official premises of Crimean Tatars. There are cases of harassment of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church representatives. The representatives of the self-proclaimed authorities banned entry to the territory of Crimea for the leader of the Crimean Tatars people, a people's deputy of Ukraine, Mustafa Zhemilov, and the head of Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, Rifat Chubarov, the public figure Ismet Yüksel, who lived in the territory of Crimea as well. More than 5,000 Crimean Tatars were forced to leave Crimea following illegal occupation and annexation by the Russian Federation. Within the territory of Peninsula, it was also forbidden to hold events dedicated to the 70th anniversary of deportation of Crimean Tatars on May 18th, the European Day of Remembrance for victims of Stalinism and Nazism on August 23rd, and celebration of the Crimean Tatar Flag Day on June 26th. It remains crucial for international observers to have access to Crimea in order to provide transparent and unbiased reporting on the human, economic, and security situation in the regions. In this regard, we urge the Russian Federation, which illegally occupied Crimea, to facilitate the access of the international monitors to assess the situation on the ground. We emphasize once again that the responsibility for all human rights violations in occupied Crimea rests on the Russian Federation as the occupying power in accordance with norms and principles of international law. We fully concur with the S&M position that, in accordance with the Bolzano recommendations, while a state may have an interest to support persons belonging to national minorities residing in other states, this does not imply in any way a right under international law to exercise jurisdiction over these persons on the territory of another state, without that state's consent and with full respect for the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. As the grave and continued manipulation of the Russian Federation of the issues involving national minorities in Ukraine is one of the central to the current crisis, we invite the OSCE High Commissioner to continue to fully use her mandate as the core conflict prevention instrument, providing early warning and seeking early action with regard to tensions involving national minorities.
Could you please conclude?
Yes, please. In light of the principles of Bolzano recommendations. Before concluding, I would like to reiterate our urgent call to the Russian Federation to stop human rights violations, including the violations of the national minorities in the occupied Crimea, to guarantee human rights, including minority rights in Crimea as the occupying power, which bears full responsibility for the territory under its control, to stop manipulation of the issues of national minorities, to stop aggression towards Ukraine in Crimea and in the East, to withdraw its troops from the territory of Ukraine, to hold support to terrorist organizations operating in the country, to correct violations of the OSCE principles of commitments and abide fully by the norms of international law and OSCE principles and commitments. And in conclusion, one last sentence. Aggression is a serious international crime which leads to serious international responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you for your intervention, and could I please ask all delegations to stick to the proposed 3-minute timeline. The following 3 interventions will be made by the Constantinopolitan Society, followed by Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association and the Association of Russian Schools in Estonia. First, Constantinopolitan Society, please.
We thank the OSCE and the Swiss chairmanship for the opportunity to address our serious concerns regarding education rights of the Greek minority in Turkey. We represent the Constantinopolitan Society, a non-governmental organization established in 1928 in Greece by forcibly expatriated members of the Greek minority of Istanbul. Greek minority schools still face a number of procedural difficulties and bureaucratic obstacles having to do with students' enrollment restrictions, that is, problems due to the limited number of students restricted by the law number 5580 on private educational institutions that must be from the specific minority, budget shortages plus discriminatory practices. Turkish authorities continue to impose enrollment restrictions to students of non-Muslim minorities. Minority schools are still governed by the law number 5580 on private educational institutions. They are treated as private schools and they continue to be listed as foreign schools. This prevents them from enrolling students above a certain quota, and they are being deprived of state funds despite the fact that it is foreseen by the Treaty of Lausanne. The registration and attendance of European and other nationality students to Greek minority schools is only permitted as guest students without receiving graduation certificates, and as a consequence, those students are not admitted to universities. The Turkish Ministry of Education should fully implement the circular revising the status of the Vice Director in minority schools as compared to that of Director that is a member of the minority, so as giving decision-making power to the Director. The Turkish Ministry of Education continues occasionally denying the appointment of minority teachers in pursuance of the principle of reciprocity. Approval of textbooks used by Greek minority schools should be facilitated through a simple and speedy process. Anti-minority references continue to exist in school books used for teaching in Turkey. Turkish identity and nationalism are promoted as fundamental values in the education system, while minority culture is ignored. All these measures are limiting the fundamental right of free access to education and thus leading to the gradual disappearance of the minority schools protected under the Treaty of Lausanne. It should be noted that Turkey is a party to the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United Nations Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and to the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. However, Turkey's reservations and declarations pertaining to the right to education upon the ratification of these covenants and conventions continue to be causes for concern. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your intervention and for respecting the time limit. We now turn to the Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. My name is Pervin Hayrullah. I am representing the Turkish minority of Western Thrace here. I would like to draw your kind attention to the violation of education rights of Western Thrace Turkish minority in Greece. Mr. Moderator, right to education is one of the basic components of human and minority rights standards. The Greek authorities, however, have almost never exercised their international responsibilities. Section 3 of the Lausanne Peace Treaty states the right to education of the Turkish minority. Also, the Hague Recommendations underlines the importance of the education rights of the minorities, as well as other international instruments. The practice in Greece is, however, absolutely against the international standards. The Greek authorities use 5-6 years old minority children as a tool to make psychological pressure to Turkish people in Western Thrace. That's to say, since 2006, the preschool education has been compulsory for all children. However, in Western Thrace, up to now, no bilingual nursery school has been opened by the Greek authorities, nor they let the minority open it. Although in 2011, one of the minority foundations applied to the Minister of Education. Without preparing the infrastructure, the authorities make pressure to Turkish people to send their children to the nursery schools in which only the Greek language is spoken. On this issue, the Greek authorities do not consider the Turkish minorities' will and do not fulfill their century-aged obligations. A very recent development we learned from a minority newspaper called Gündem releases the Greek intention towards the Turkish people in Western Thrace. Greece in 1995 introduced 0.5% quota for the university entrance for the minority students of Western Thrace. However, while calculating the Turkish students' points, they didn't consider the students' school grades for who attending the Turkish minority high schools, although they did it for the other students. This means that those students attending the minority high schools getting lower grades to enter a good or a higher graded department. These are just two examples of the Greek violations of education rights of the Turkish minority. Mr. Moderator, we will be honored if a fact-finding mission of OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities would visit us to see one of the most backward areas of the EU firsthand. Also, I would like to recommend Greece to take into consideration its international obligations and respect to the Turkish minorities' right to education, to allow the Turkish minority to establish its bilingual nursery schools, to give bilingual education in public nursery schools where the Turkish students attend until the bilingual minority ones are established, to have a concrete dialogue with the Turkish minority representatives during the legislation process. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your intervention. The following three statements will be made by the Russian schools in Estonia, the Latvian Human Rights Committee, and the delegation of Turkey. But first, Russian schools in Estonia.
Hello, everyone. During the last 25 years, the official politics of Estonia can be called as a Russophobia. Thus, it is worth mentioning that according to the Estonian laws, Russians are not a national minority. In general, the term national minority is not used in Estonia. Instead, the direct translation can be put as small nationality. For the external observers, Estonians easily transform the term small nationality to the national minority. The distinctive features for small nationality is that in accordance with Estonian laws, the people who belong to it are exclusively citizens of Estonia, although the Estonian citizenship was stolen from the majority of Russians in 1992, which has led to the stateless status for these people. Many international organizations were repeatedly criticizing given approach of Estonian state, telling that it has a freezing effect, but that critics made no effect on Estonian lawmakers. For us, it is principle that this approach, besides having a freezing effect, contradicts humanitarian standards, as the rights of national minority belong to the human rights and not for rights of citizens. Another aspect which is important to highlight here is the extreme politicization of ethnic relationship in Estonia, which had found deep roots in the country laws. There is no single law in Estonia which would allow to take non-political decision on the matters concerning ethnic relationship. In other words, there is no single such law which would have some criteria for making decision in the area of ethnic relationship and would allow a decision maker to forget his or her ethnicity when making a decision. Now we demand to provide for Russian minority the equal rights. We demand to stop discrimination of the Russian minority, and we demand to stop politicization in our legislation in our country. Thank you.
Thank you for this intervention. We turn to the Latvian Human Rights Committee.
Thank you very much. I represent the Latvian Human Rights Committee from Riga, and the biggest concern for ethnic minorities, and especially speakers of minority languages, who are mostly Russian speakers, more than a third of the population according to the last census, is the initiative to switch the education in public schools, except subjects related to minority culture, to one official language only. This aim was announced in the coalition agreement in January this year, with a plan to implement it by 2018. This intent obviously contradicts both the Article 14 of the Framework Convention on the Protection of National Minorities and the OSCE Hague recommendations on education rights of national minorities. On 12 August this year, the Cabinet of Ministers adopted regulations on the standards of basic education, and one of their annexes suggests a few models for minority and Latvian bilingualism in basic schools of minorities. All of them are harshly restricting the possibilities to teach in minority languages, and if a school chooses its own model of bilingualism, then in grades 7 to 9 it will have to teach at least 60% of hours in the official Latvian language. This is the share which is also already applied to the secondary schools, meaning grade 10 to grade 12. Another problem of the same magnitude is the reduction of the network of minority schools. In the last 15 years, the number of minority schools in Latvia was reduced by half. With the case of Russian language schools, even more than that. Besides the tertiary education system, while the existence of private universities shows demand for education in Russian, is publicly available only in Latvian language, in some cases in English, and the public universities do not teach teachers for teaching in minority schools specifically. Finally, there is a unified exam in the 12th grade for those graduating from Latvian schools and minority schools in Latvian language. The results, unsurprisingly, are different, and this can impact the right to tertiary education. So we recommend the OSCE to send a strong signal on the necessity to respect the Hague recommendation on education rights of national minorities, and Latvia to respect the principle of free choice of different models of bilingualism in school. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The following three interventions will be made by Turkey, the Federation of Western Trace Turks in Europe, and Switzerland. First, the delegation of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We take the floor today to reiterate our concern with the repeated and increasing infringements upon the rights of minority groups in Crimea. We believe that the safety and welfare of all ethnic groups in Crimea should remain high among our priorities. We have also repeatedly underlined our special sensitivity and concern for the security and well-being of the Crimean Tatar minority. We would like to take this opportunity to once again commend High Commissioner Tor's valuable efforts and engagement within the framework of the crisis in Ukraine, including her visit to the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. We appreciate her continued interest in the situation of the Crimean Tatars and other minorities. Mr. Moderator, the deteriorating human rights situation in Crimea was highlighted in this summer's report of the Human Rights Assessment Mission conducted jointly by ODIHR and the HCNM. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission has also drawn attention to the human rights violations in Crimea in all its reports to date. Due to the illegal and illegitimate de facto situation in Crimea, which Turkey continues to regard as part of Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars, like the vast majority of the peninsula's population, were deprived of their fundamental right to take part in last April's presidential elections, and thus to share in the democratic expression of Ukraine's national will. It is unfortunately very likely that they will also be hindered from participating in next October's parliamentary elections. In May, the Crimean Tatars were hindered from officially commemorating the 70th anniversary of their tragic mass deportations in the Soviet era after the banning of large gatherings in Crimea. Mr. Mustafa Cemilev, leader of the Crimean Tatar people, and Mr. Refat Chubarov, president of the Crimean Tatar National Assembly, the Mejlis, continued to be denied entry into their homeland of Crimea. These entry bans are a flagrant violation of international law. We have been informed of many instances of harassment, abduction, and murder of Crimean Tatar activists. Harassment of and attacks against Crimean Tatar journalists also continue, as regularly highlighted by the representative on freedom of the media. We are also deeply concerned by the mounting pressure against the Crimean Tatar National Assembly, which is the sole legitimate representative body of the Crimean Tatar people. We condemn such unacceptable methods of pressure to intimidate the Crimean Tatars, who are an indigenous people of the peninsula defending their democratic rights through peaceful means. Confident that the international community will not remain silent in the face of these repressive measures, we call on those responsible to desist from such acts. In conclusion, we would like to emphasize once again that Turkey will continue to closely